Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
I want to start with some news. Just recently, the cybersecurity news announced that Ticketmaster had another breach. This is not their first time. Ticketmaster was breached in 2018. They were also fined in 2020 by the UK for failing to keep customer data secure. And interesting enough, they were fined in 2020 by the Department of Justice for keeping the credentials of a former employee of a competitor. And then they used those credentials to access the competitor's systems to try to, quote unquote, choke off the victim's business. That was super interesting. But recently, there's a cybersecurity group that claims it has stolen some personal data that belongs to 500 million Ticketmaster customers. The cyber criminal group is called Shiny Hunters, and in an online forum, they said that they gained access to Ticketmaster's customer information, and they're trying to sell that information. The breach has not been independently verified, and Ticketmaster hasn't responded yet. But some of the data that was released by this group seems to be information that would not otherwise be seen together, like customer addresses and phone numbers, partial credit card details, order and transaction info. So that would lead a reasonable person to believe that they probably have something. Overall, I think this isn't a surprise. Breaches happen all the time. Ticketmaster, I think, has just been in the news a lot lately. They're actually being sued right now. Their parent company, Live Nation, is being sued for monopolistic practices. And, this isn't the first time they've been breached. So if you are a Ticketmaster customer, which I am, make sure that you go and change your usernames and passwords, something that I did just recently. And then obviously monitor any of your bank accounts, your credit cards for sign of fraud or unusual behavior. You could also initiate a fraud or credit freeze, and then realize that with this information, you may be a target for phishing. So you might get an email that says, hey, you have a deal on some tickets or some free tickets, or here's some benefits, so on and so forth. So just understand that your email and your name and everything was leaked. And so if you do have an account there, be on the lookout for any type of phishing scams that might happen.
I was about to just respond to this with a yawn because it's another day, another breach. But the last thing you said was maybe the most interesting, where you point out that with this information, attackers could send very convincing phishing emails where they could say, hey, did you like band X on this date? Then you would like this. Click here for free tickets. And it could be very believable because they have all your information. And, it kind of gets to the point that if these phishing people would get better at their grammar and their image manipulation, they could really be effective at this. It's kind of good for us, the good guys, that they're still really terrible at English and grammar and image manipulation, because it's still usually pretty obvious. But they could, with pretty much a simple mail merge and some basic HTML, put together some pretty convincing messages. So good point to be alert. And as always, if you're not already using a password manager, here's another good example of why you should. If your Ticketmaster password is unique and not reused, you have very little to worry about. Congratulations, you've stolen one unique password that I don't use anywhere else. Whatever, the end. But if you reuse it, now you've got a bigger problem on your hands. So that's why that security guidance is given out so frequently, because it works.
The interesting thing that you said, Adam, is that if cyber criminals got better at crafting these emails, and I think this is one area where the AI technology can help them.
Absolutely.
Being able to craft emails and images and probably even write the HTML code for them. There's probably examples out there that you can at least start with. And so I think they may be stepping up their game just based on some of the machine learning and AI models that are out there now.
Really good point, because it seems they struggle with writing English because they're not native speakers. And if there's one thing large language models do well, it's write excellent, well-formatted, grammatically correct English. And so they could provide a prompt, even if it doesn't completely sound right, and it could turn into picture perfect English. That's a really good point. So we got to watch out for that. I will say, as sophisticated as so many of these attacks have been, it's odd that phishing in general has not received this level of sophistication to this point. And maybe I'm just baiting them to do it, but I'm thankful they haven't yet.
All right, speaking of AI, the next thing I wanted to talk about was Slack. And this was a couple of weeks ago, but there was an outcry from privacy and security advocates because Slack announced, and I don't even know if they announced it. I think someone got an updated terms of conditions or something like that. And it essentially said by default, without requiring users to opt in, Slack was using its systems to analyze customer data and usage information, which includes messages, content, and files, to build their AI and ML models and improve the software. Slack insisted that it had technical controls to block Slack from accessing the underlying content, and promises the data will not lead across workplaces, which is their tenants essentially. But despite the assurances, corporate Slack admins have been scrambling to try to turn this off, which you can go into the settings and opt out of this data scraping. Slack AI, which is a generative AI experience that's built into Slack, is like a separate add-on that Slack customers can purchase. And it uses a large language model. Slack says that it doesn't use customer data to train the large language model that Slack AI is built on, because it's hosted on its own infrastructure. The data remains within the customer's control, and it's exclusively for the organization's use. It never leaves Slack's trust boundaries, essentially. And in the documentation, Slack also reiterates that the data isn't going to be leaked across workspaces. And for any models that are being broadly used across all customers, so all of Slack's customer base, they don't use or build these models in a way that they could learn or memorize or be able to reproduce part of the customer's data. So I take things, obviously, that come from big companies like this with a grain of salt. But to me, it does sound like, for the most part, the practices that they're doing are on par with what most companies are doing, with the exception of, by default, they opted in the customer to run these algorithms. While they do stay within their workspace or their tenant, it is something that Slack just said, yeah, we're going to go ahead and do it. I think maybe in the case that they can demonstrate what Slack AI can do for that customer, or hopefully sell it to them, or I don't know what their reasoning is for turning it on, as far as like just generating that core experience. But sounds like they're not using that data to train the larger large language model, which is an important note here. So some outcry for sure, but I don't think it is as bad as what most people kind of made it out to be.
Full disclosure, Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our cybersecurity field sales organization. Slack is, of course, a competitor to Microsoft, and their parent company, Salesforce, is as well. However, as we always mention, this podcast is on our personal time and is not affiliated with Microsoft nor funded by Microsoft. So we just talk about cybersecurity as a whole from an academic perspective, not a competitive one. This is interesting. And as I'm listening to you walk through it, Andy, I'm having trouble squaring the circle, because we talked in the pre-show about this, and kind of the way I compared it was, in Microsoft 365, we have Copilot for Microsoft 365. And as part of enabling that, we create a semantic index of your data in your Microsoft 365 tenant. And we're very clear that That semantic index is unique to you. It never leaves your tenant. All existing security, privacy, and compliance controls remain in place. It remains within the same geographic and trust boundaries that you expect. And part of our philosophy was we're not going to do that work, which is computationally expensive work to do, until you have purchased Copilot for Microsoft 365 licenses. We need customers to share in that cost because it's expensive to operate. So what's interesting here is you talked about how there's Slack AI, which is a generative AI experience native to Slack, is a separately purchased add-on. What's not clear to me from this conversation is, did Slack opt in every Slack workspace and start analyzing it regardless of if they had bought this add-on? Or was this language in place in the privacy policy to cover only customers who opt into that, which would be very similar to how Microsoft operates? That's not clear, because if it's all of these things Slack says it is, if it's unique to each workspace, if it's not used to train the underlying model, if it can't leak across workspaces, then why are they doing it? Because again, that costs a lot of money to do that indexing, that inferencing, that work, unless they benefit from it somehow. And if it's all kind of segregated to each tenant or workspace, as they call it, that to me is unclear. So I think there's more to unpack here as time goes on. But I agree with you that overall, I think from a security, privacy, compliance perspective, there's nothing terribly concerning here. Other than, again, if it's just opt-in by default, that just, it doesn't sit well with people. They like to feel in control of it. And not to say that our way is the best way or the only way, but the way Microsoft has done that is it's opt-in by virtue of payment. Until you cut us a check for Copilot from M365, we don't do it. And I think that's one major difference. And maybe that's where people are somewhat upset. But again, you're right. Slack didn't come out and announce this forthright. People found this in like a privacy policy or a terms of service or that sort of thing. And so maybe it was even being quoted kind of out of context, and it was really only applicable to customers who had invested in that add-on. So I think I'd love to know more, but agree that in general, you should maybe step away from the cliff. But if you want to opt out, by all means, if you're not using it yet, opt out.
Yeah. Couple of good questions and points there for sure, Adam. So the last thing I wanted to focus on is, as part of the new announcements last week at Build, so this is a little follow on, and we didn't talk about it too much, but we did mention that there was a whole new class of computing devices that Microsoft announced, which was Copilot plus PC with these new NPUs that were inside of them. And one of the features that is unique to these Copilot plus PCs is something called Windows Recall. And so this is a feature that's designed to work with these Copilot PCs, and it's supposed to run in the background and capture everything you do on the computer, documenting it, triaging it, and then turning it into things that you can search for later. What's really important to understand about this, of course, there was a huge uproar about this because there is some language that Microsoft had put in there saying, hey, if you capture things like passwords or sensitive information, that is going to be part of recall as well. So I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a dive into this because I didn't know too much about it until I started reading about it, and then some of the security and privacy concerns and things that we can talk about. So number one, it's important to remember that the experience of this Windows Recall is rendered on the device. It doesn't reach out to the cloud to process any information. So this is important for both privacy and performance reasons. And to reduce latency, Microsoft says the recall relies on the NPU to process that content that has been recorded. And Microsoft can't see the contents of any of the snapshots. It's also not automatically enabled. However, users are prompted to enable it during the setup process. So I do understand some concern because those setup processes, a lot of people kind of just click through. I don't know. I haven't seen it in person, so I don't know if like the toggle switch is off and then you toggle it on, or you have to like toggle it off, so on and so forth in the out-of-box experience. But they say it's not turned on automatically. However, if you do prompt it to turn on, it's going to download all the AI components that are required for Windows Recall to function. The download is fairly big. It's multiple gigabytes in size, and it does not require the use of a Microsoft account. It can be used offline once the initial setup is complete. So again, kind of proving the point that all that stuff is running locally on the device. So it's a neat feature. What are the benefits of really using it, right? What are the benefits of really using it? Windows Recall is built around a semantic search. The app includes a search bar, a timeline that runs at the top of the app. It also lets users find memories based on what you remember seeing. It's recording and triaging everything you do on the computer, and anything you do can become something that you can search for. So another thing to remember is that because it's AI based, it allows you to search for things using natural language. You're not really confined to specific search terms that have to be really accurate. If, for example, you're looking for like a document that a colleague sent you on, say, Slack, you could type in, find that Word document that Adam sent me on Slack a few weeks ago, and that should give you some results based on that Windows Recall has captured. You can also pause the snapshot process by clicking the recall icon on the taskbar, something like pause until tomorrow. You can resume the snapshots on the same interface, and it also tells you when the app on screen is being filtered. So a couple of things too. So that icon will always show you when it's recording, and as far as I have read, it's not something that you can turn off. So it's always, because you can hide icons sometimes on your smart bar or on your Windows bar, start menu bar, and you can't really do that with this that I found. So they're saying that it's always going to be on. You're always going to be notified when it's running and taking snapshots. And it has some of these built-in safety privacy tools. You can configure these filters so you can filter out different websites. If you want to enter in a website, you're like, never take a snapshot when I'm on this website. You can do that. It can also automatically stop capturing snapshots if you enter in private browsing mode in a browser. And that works with Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and Opera currently. And you can also delete snapshots right from the app in bulk. Like you could do it for like the last hour or the last month. You can also delete all your snapshots in one go. All the data, again, is collected and stored locally. It doesn't get uploaded. And if you have BitLocker, which is turned on by default these days, it is encrypted. So it is part of that encryption process, just like any other data is locally on your device. The biggest point of concern comes with the content moderation, because if there are sensitive sites that you're going to, sensitive information, password, financial data, medical data, whatever it is, if you don't filter out those apps and websites first, then they will be part of the snapshot. But you can always go back and delete those snapshots later just by selecting the snapshot and deleting it. So it's a lot like your browser history on speed, I think, is really what it is, because it's everything. And so you can always go back to your browser history and delete things from your browser history just the same way as you can with this recall. And then again, you can pre-filter stuff. Like if I was using it, I'd probably put in like my bank website and, my medical websites that I go to, like my MyChart and stuff like that. You can just put that in there. It'll filter it out, and it won't capture it. Or you can pause it. Just say pause it for the next hour while I do this, or go to an incognito browser. So there's a lot of ways to exclude your data from getting snapshotted. So I don't think it's as big as a concern as a lot of people think it is. And I do think there is some benefit, especially if people use their machine a lot for document creation, and you're like, oh, I need to find this. Or if you like looked at something yesterday and you're thinking like, man, what was that, shirt site that I was looking at, find the shirt site that I was looking at yesterday. That was a gray shirt, and I paused on it for a little bit. Like, you can just ask it a question, and it'll probably find the snapshot. And I do think there are definitely some uses, and I'd be interested to try it out in person.
One of the things this highlighted in our online discourse, and let me preface my comments by saying I am extremely pro-journalism. I subscribe to my local newspaper, the Des Moines Register. I still get it on dead trees 4 days a week because I like the act of actually reading the newspaper over a cup of coffee. I appreciate the work journalists do. There was some journalistic malpractice associated with initial reporting on this feature, to where I believe it was the BBC who basically rushed to go find someone who was a privacy expert to comment on this. And she, without having read any technical documentation or understanding how the feature worked, was quoted as saying, "This is a privacy nightmare." And everyone is entitled to their opinion, but this was where the BBC was trying to, present both sides. So they went and found someone who is vehemently against it. But there's one thing to report both sides. It's another thing to do it in a way that's fair and balanced, and you're talking to experts on both sides, as opposed to someone just to give you a great quote. I was disappointed in that, because while people are entitled to their opinion and to say this is not for me and I don't want to use this, I think making those comments without understanding the architecture or how the technology works is disappointing. So I'd like everyone to do better in that sense. Andy, I think you walked through it really well. I will add a couple of bits of color here. Copilot Plus PCs, there's a whole specification and standard to get that title bestowed upon your device. And whether it's a Microsoft Surface device or Lenovo, Dell, HP, Asus, and so on, it has to meet certain characteristics. And there's been a lot of focus on it must have an NPU, a neural processing unit with 40 trillion operations per second or more. It must have 16 gigs of RAM. We all heard that. What has been discussed less, although we touched on this in our last show, Andy, is that there are Windows security updates that come with that title as well. Every device that's a Copilot Plus PC must be a secured core PC, which means things like virtualization-based security are on by default. It must ship with the higher security level of Windows Hello, and it must ship with the Microsoft Pluton security coprocessor or component built in to the processor. Automatically, all of those things are required to be included. So when we talk about, to your point, Andy, this is all done locally. You download that package of what they actually are, small language models, SLMs that run on the device. 30 different small language models run to enable the recall feature. And those are the things that are doing that, enabling the natural language search that Andy walked through so well. But then all of that, which is stored locally, processed locally, handled locally, to Andy's point, you have virtualization-based security, you have BitLocker by default, you have enhanced Windows Hello by default, all enabled to really secure this experience. I can understand if it's not for everyone, you're not comfortable with it, but I think from the perspective of doing the right thing, of getting this on device, off the cloud, local to you, protected with the best local security solutions possible, I think all of that's been done. And again, we already disclosed, Andy and I both work for Microsoft, although not in this part of the company that's worked on this. Again, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but I think from a perspective of, is this secure? Does this protect your privacy at a local level? Sure. There's still risks inherent with it. If someone were to gain physical access to your PC, they could, again, go through anything you've done and find it with very simple natural language searches. It's a very powerful tool that can be used for malicious purposes in the wrong hands. That's, of course, a legitimate concern, as is what Andy talked about, creating memories from sensitive sites or sensitive applications, password managers as well. We'd also probably want to exclude from this. So I think, like every tool, there's going to be a learning curve over time of how to properly use it, just like we learned about browsers and how to manage browser history and the things we do and don't want included in our browser history. And just like we're learning how to work with large language models, and they are not intended to be something that can always generate facts on the first try. They're designed to be creative. And the fact that it's normal and expected that you're going to have to modify some of the output and do human review of the output before it's suitable for its final use. You can't just use the output without modification because it's just not designed for that. It needs human review. These are all things we're learning over time, and I think we'll learn over time with this too. But from a perspective of our listeners who are, of course, interested in, is it secure? Is it private? And oh, by the way, how do we administrate it in our business? All of this is controllable through traditional device management. If you want to turn this off, there's going to be Intune controls and other methods of disabling this if you don't want it used in your organization. So that's easily handleable as well. So I think a good summary here for our listeners, and I would encourage everyone to learn more and experiment with this before forming your own conclusions. I think obviously very cool technology, and we're going to need to figure out the best way to manage it and use it both in our personal and work lives.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the physical security portion of it, because as with most things in security and it comes to computing, when an attacker has physical access, it's almost like all bets are off. Now, I'm glad you also talked about the secure core and Pluton processor, because one of the concerns in the past has been the bypass of BitLocker, right? If you go back into some of our shows, we've talked about this bypass and this limitation where the TPM or the TPM is a separate chip, and it was designed like that. And it has a secure bus that essentially decrypts and has the bits transfer over to decrypt the key for BitLocker. And using the right tools and wiretaps and everything with physical access and enough time, attackers can essentially sniff the key on the bus because that bus is unencrypted and you're able to do that. So that's a limitation of BitLocker and really the TPM design. But many, many years ago, Microsoft had talked about this secure core PC and Pluton processor, where the design is we're going to implement that TPM into the CPU chip itself. It's going to be all part of it. It's not a separate chip that requires a bus to, transverse that key over it and can be sniffed. Like, you cannot sniff BitLocker keys on a Pluton processor because it's integrated. Essentially a system on a chip.
Great point.
So now that is not a limitation on these devices. So again, one of the more secure things when you go to one of these newer PCs, the MPUs, all of them are going to be secure core PCs. And that BitLocker concern of, oh, they might be able to bypass it, that's not a concern here. Now, what is still a concern is obviously access if they have your password to your MSA account or your work account, or they know your PIN if you have it, using Windows Hello for Business or some other, facial or something like that. So there are still obviously ways to unlock BitLocker with the other secrets that are there, but they can't just sniff it without you physically being present or knowing something about you. So
the proverbial $10 wrench, hit them with it till they tell us their password. But the default behavior now when setting up a consumer Windows environment is to set it up as passwordless. That is the default behavior. You sign into your MSA, hopefully using Authenticator app and passwordless technology there, and then it will set it up and provision it on Windows 11 without a password at all. So just biometric and PIN, which are more secure than a password anyway. So also some improved security and going passwordless from a perspective of removing the password from your Entra ID account is coming soon too. So more to look forward to.
Well, that seems like a great place to wrap things up. Really good show today. All the links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes, as well as our contact information if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.